The last hours before dawn outside Iconium feel louder than they should. Not with music, not with speeches, but with small sounds that carry in dry air. A horse shifts its weight, and the leather creaks. A whetstone scrapes along steel with a slow, patient rhythm. Somewhere in the darkness, a man coughs and tries to swallow it so it won't wake the ones around him. The wind pushes dust across the ground in thin sheets. It gets into everything, into the seams of tents, into the folds of cloaks, into the joints of mail where iron rings rub together whenever a soldier turns in uneasy sleep. If you've ever tried to rest when you already know tomorrow will be worse, you understand this kind of night. Your body begs for sleep. Your mind keeps listening. I'm Steve Turcotte, and I want to bring you into this moment because this is where a campaign becomes personal. Before banners move, before arrows fly, before anyone can pretend they're fearless, this is the moment when an exhausted army has to decide whether it will keep moving forward or accept that stopping might be another way of dying. Somewhere ahead, beyond the dark, Iconium sits behind its walls. Even at this distance, it feels like a presence, stone against sky, a hard line that blocks the road. The city is danger, obviously, but it's also food, water, shelter, the place with storehouses and supplies that can keep an army alive for another week, another month, another stretch of road that seems to never end. In the German camp, the men don't look like polished figures from a romance. Their gear is worn and repaired, straps are cracked, shields are scratched, mail shirts are dulled by dust and sweat. Even sitting down takes effort now. When a man kneels near a fire, you can see the stiffness in his back as he lowers himself. He moves like someone who has been marching too long and sleeping too little. And the smell of food, if you can call it that, drifts through the camp anyway. It isn't a feast, it's barely bread, a little flour, a little water, and whatever scraps can be found, cooked into something that keeps a stomach from turning on itself. But that smell does something powerful. It reminds men they're still alive. It puts a shape to what they're fighting for, even if no one says it out loud. You can hear murmured voices between tents. Some are prayers, spoken softly like someone afraid the words might break. Some are arguments that never grow into shouting because no one has strength to waste. It's a strange thing how exhaustion can make men quieter. Not calmer, just quieter. The priests move through the ranks with small candles and low voices. Some soldiers lean towards them like drowning men towards driftwood. Others stare past them toward the faint silhouette of the city, thinking about bread and water, and about how far they've come to get trapped here. A vow can carry a man a long distance. So can stubbornness. Sometimes they look the same from the outside. I think about the word honor in moments like this. Honor sounds clean when you say it in a hall with banners and music. Out here, with your mouth dry and your hands shaking from fatigue, honor becomes complicated. It can mean discipline, it can mean restraint, it can also become a shield people hide behind, an excuse for what they were going to do anyway. And still, for all the strain, there is discipline in this camp. That's easy to miss if you only imagine Crusaders as wild zealots. Sentries rotate, fires are kept small, weapons are checked, horses, what's left of them, are tethered and guarded like treasure. Even now, even this deep in hostile country, someone is thinking about tomorrow's formation, tomorrow's spacing, tomorrow's moment when fear could turn into panic. Beyond the edge of torchlight, there are other men in motion. Seljuk riders, scouts and raiders, barely seen, often only felt. Sometimes you catch them as silhouettes on a ridge, sometimes you don't see them at all, and that's worse, because the mind fills in the blank. A Western soldier wants a clear battle, an enemy that stands and accepts a collision. The Seljuk way of war doesn't always offer that. It offers pressure, harassment, the constant reminder that you are being watched, and that every mistake will be punished. Men try to sleep on cloaks beside their shields. Some manage it, some never do. You can spot the ones who can't sleep by how they stare into the fire, eyes reflecting flame like they're looking at something far away. They're not dreaming about glory. They're doing quiet arithmetic with their lives. How much water is left? How far the walls are? What happens if the horses fail? What happens if the gates never open? Inside the command area, under heavier tents, near the standards that mark authority, the atmosphere is different, but not easier. There, the air smells of candle smoke and old cloth. Wax drips onto rough tables. Maps are spread out like prayers that don't quite know who they're addressed to. Men lean in close, not because they're conspirators, but because speaking louder doesn't make the problem smaller. This is where decisions are made that will be paid for in blood, not with dramatic speeches, with quiet sentences, with a nod, with a hand placed flat on a table as if to hold the world still.
And somewhere in the center of all this is a question that isn't really about tactics. It's about what kind of suffering you're willing to accept. Do you wait and be worn down day by day? Or do you strike, even if striking feels reckless, because the slow option is killing you already? The sky begins to change. Black turns to deep blue. The torches start to look smaller, less important. Dust still moves across the plain, but now it catches the first light and becomes almost golden. There's a strange beauty in it, and I always find that unsettling. War has a way of dressing itself in beauty right before it does something ugly. In those last minutes before dawn, the camp seems to hold its breath. You can feel it in the way men stand a little straighter when officers pass, in the way hands linger on sword hilts and spear shafts, in the way everyone suddenly seems careful with their energy, as if the body already knows it will need every bit of it soon. No one out here truly knows how the day will end. They don't get the comfort of hindsight. They only have the weight of the moment and the sense that the choice has already been made. And that's where I'll leave you, on the edge of light, with dust in the air, with the smell of thin bread over small fires, with prayers murmured into the dark, and with a tired army preparing to step forward, not into legend, into a day they may not survive.
When people talk about the Third Crusade, they often jump straight to the famous names and the famous battles. But before any of that, there's a shockwave, something that hits Europe like a cold wind through a church door. In the year 1187, Jerusalem falls to Saladin. For many in the Latin West, it isn't just a military defeat, it feels like a spiritual wound. The news doesn't arrive as a single dramatic announcement. It arrives along roads, through letters and sermons, carried by travelers who repeat the same words until they sound unreal. And once it sinks in, it changes what kings and emperors feel they must do. I'm Steve Turcotte, and I want you to picture the moment after that realization sets in, not the charge of an army, but the first steps towards building one. Because a crusade isn't a single event, it's a slow assembly of money, men, animals, ships, promises, and fear. Europe responds the way medieval Europe often does under pressure, with a mixture of genuine devotion and hard politics. Rulers know that joining a crusade can be an act of faith. They also know it can be an act of power. It can unite nobles who might otherwise turn on each other. It can build prestige. It can silence critics, at least for a time. Three leaders dominate the story in the popular memory: Richard of England, Philip of France, and Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor. Richard and Philip take the sea route. It's faster, and in some ways it's cleaner. You can move supplies by ship. You can avoid months of hostile terrain. But the sea has its own dangers, and the politics of ports can be just as sharp as the politics of borders. Barbarossa, though, chooses the overland route. That decision is easy to underestimate because we tend to think of maps as neat lines and fixed distances. In reality, taking an army across the continent is like dragging a city on foot. You need food every day. You need fodder for horses. You need water that won't kill you. You need roads that can carry wagons. And you need permission, formal or informal, to pass through other people's territory without starting another war before your crusade even begins. And that brings us to the Byzantine Empire. By the late 12th century, Byzantium is not a simple ally for Western crusaders. It is a Christian empire with its own fears and its own strategy, and it has long experience with large, unpredictable Western armies passing through. The emperor at the time, Isaac II Angelus, has to weigh everything. A massive German host can help against Muslim powers, or it can become a threat to Constantinople itself. Even if Barbarossa swears good intentions, intentions are not supplies, and vows don't prevent accidents, hunger, or violence. So, agreements are made. Tensions flare anyway. Suspicion travels with the Crusaders like a second shadow. The Germans see obstacles and delays and wonder if they are being undermined. Byzantines see armed foreigners and wonder if they are being set up for disaster. In a world like this, trust is fragile and it breaks easily. Medieval writers often inflate numbers, and the Third Crusade is no exception. Some sources describe an enormous force under Barbarossa, so large it feels almost mythical.
Modern historians usually treat those numbers with caution, and for good reason. The larger an army is, the harder it is to feed, especially once it leaves friendly land. So if you're looking for a single true number, you won't find it. What you can say is that Barbarossa's host was large by the standards of the age, and organized enough to keep moving across vast distances. That organization, in its own way, is a weapon. But once the army reaches Anatolia, the logic of war changes. Ceremony fades, and logistics takes over. It becomes less about banners and speeches, and more about water skins, broken wheels, sick men, and dead horses. Anatolia is harsh on armies that can't live on the land, and when the land is hostile, when local supplies are denied or contested, the road becomes a long test of endurance. You don't need a dramatic battle every day to destroy an invading force. You just need to keep it hungry, thirsty, and exhausted for long enough. That's one reason the overland choice matters so much. The sea route risks storms and shipwrecks. The overland route risks everything else, every day, without pause. Heat that bakes men inside armor, dust that dries throats and blinds eyes, long stretches where you're not sure the next water source is safe, and always the knowledge that if you stop moving, you become easier to surround. So when I imagine this part of the story, I think about how war narrows a person's world. At the beginning, men might talk about grand purpose, the recovery of the holy city, the fulfillment of vows. But after weeks on the road, purpose competes with more basic thoughts. How many miles today? How much grain is left? Whether the horses can keep going? Whether the next town will open its gates or shut them? And that's where the moral picture gets complicated. Crusaders are often framed as holy warriors marching with clean intention, but armies are made of humans, and humans carry hunger, pride, resentment, and fear. Sometimes faith lifts them, sometimes it hardens them, sometimes it becomes a way to justify what necessity is already demanding. By the time Barbarossa's army presses deeper into Anatolia, the crusade is no longer a distant ideal. It's an immediate struggle to keep cohesion, a struggle to keep discipline, a struggle to prevent thousands of small frustrations from becoming a collapse. And if you step back and look at the larger stage, you can see the shape of what's coming. Richard and Philip move across the sea towards the Levant. Barbarossa grinds across land. 3 leaders, 1 goal, different roads, and different kinds of risk. So when we arrive at the outskirts of Iconium later in the story, it won't be an isolated moment. It will be the result of weeks of decisions and compromises, between devotion and politics, between speed and safety, between what a commander wants and what the land will allow. That's the truth underneath the legend. Before the drama of walls and battle cries, there is the long march. And in medieval warfare, the march can be deadlier than the fight.
If you want to understand what happened on the road to Iconium, you have to stop thinking in terms of legends for a moment and start thinking in terms of people, real people, with tired bodies, imperfect information, and reputations they can't afford to lose. Frederick Barbarossa was already an old man by the standards of his century, late 60s. That fact alone changes how I picture him, not as a gleaming crusader in a painting, but as a ruler whose joints would have ached after long days in the saddle, whose strength had to be managed, and whose authority depended on projecting steadiness even when he felt the strain. By the time he marched into Anatolia, he wasn't learning how war worked. He'd spent decades in conflict, especially in Italy, and decades navigating the dangerous politics of the empire. He understood something that younger commanders sometimes don't, that battles aren't only about killing. They're about making the right people believe the right story afterward. In the medieval world, reputation could be as powerful as armor. Barbarossa had built a reputation that could stabilize noble factions and intimidate rivals. But reputation is also a trap. Once you become the kind of ruler people expect to be fearless, you don't get to show hesitation, not without paying for it. And that's why I think his decision to lead an overland crusade matters so much.
It's not simply a strategic choice between sea and land. It's a statement. It says, I will endure what others avoid. It says, my authority can survive distance, heat, and hostile ground. It says, I'm still the kind of emperor who moves forward. At his side is his son, Duke Frederick of Swabia. And if Barbarossa represents the weight of a lifetime, Duke Frederick represents the pressure of a future that hasn't been earned yet. He's young enough that ambition still burns hot, but it isn't the clean ambition of a storybook hero. It's the ambition of someone living under a name that fills a room before he speaks. In dynastic politics, an heir doesn't just inherit a throne, he inherits expectations. Every decision becomes a test, every moment becomes public. I imagine him watching his father in the command tent at night, listening to men who have fought for decades, and realizing that he's expected to become that kind of presence. Not eventually, soon, maybe sooner than he wants. In Crusade narratives, heirs are often treated as characters in a drama, brave sons, loyal sons, tragic sons. But in a real campaign, a young commander is also a working officer. He deals with tired horses, angry knights, frightened infantry, and the quiet risk of getting it wrong at the worst time. Now, on the other side of the plain, you have Sultan Kilij Arslan II of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. Western sources sometimes describe him and his forces in broad strokes, as if one man's will controls everything. But states don't work like that, and medieval states especially don't. By the year 1190, Kilij Arslan was not a young conqueror. He was an older ruler in a realm that had its own internal tensions. Rivalries between commanders, rivalries within the ruling family, competing loyalties among tribes and military elites. That matters, because it affects how quickly an army can respond, how coordinated a strategy can really be, and how much a commander can rely on obedience when pressure hits. When we say the Sultan decided, what we often mean is, the Sultan tried to manage a system that was always in motion. And if you're listening closely, you can hear why this campaign refuses to become a simple morality play. It isn't civilization versus barbarism. It isn't hero versus villain. It's older men leading younger men into conditions that punish everyone, and leaders on both sides trying to control events that don't fully belong to them. I'm Steve Turcotte, and this is the part of the story where I like to slow down and ask a question that's uncomfortable but honest. What is destiny, really? We use the word as if history has a script, as if these men were pulled toward Iconium by something mystical. But when you read medieval campaigns closely, it's rarely destiny. It's pressure, it's logistics, it's pride, it's fear. It's the slow narrowing of options until what looks like a bold decision is actually the only decision left. For Barbarossa, the pressure is obvious. The overland march means his army lives or dies based on movement. If he pauses too long, he runs out of food. If he retreats, he loses credibility, and perhaps his entire crusading enterprise. If he hesitates, the enemy's harassment continues, and the land keeps taking its toll. For Duke Frederick, the pressure is personal as well as military. If the army suffers and he appears passive, he risks being remembered as the heir who couldn't carry the burden. If he takes risks, he risks dying before the story even reaches its next chapter. And for Kilij Arslan, the pressure is political as well as strategic. Allowing a huge foreign army to cross Anatolia unpunished damages authority, but committing too much to a single battle carries risks as well, especially when the enemy is stubborn enough to keep marching even when exhausted. This is why I'm careful with the knightly myth. Knights were trained fighters, yes. Many were brave. But bravery doesn't erase fatigue. It doesn't stop heatstroke. It doesn't make a horse immortal. And it doesn't automatically make a decision wise. What separates a commander from a myth is that a commander is forced to choose without certainty. Barbarossa could not see the ending. Neither could his son. Neither could Kilij Arslan. They were all working inside partial information, rumors, and the shifting reality of a campaign where scouts might be wrong and terrain might betray you. So when the story later arrives at Iconium's walls, I don't see three symbols colliding. I see three human beings pushed forward by circumstance. An emperor who has to keep looking unbreakable, because empire is as much performance as it is law. A young duke learning in real time that leadership is not a title, it's a burden that sinks into your shoulders. And a sultan balancing war against internal stability, knowing that one defeat can change how subjects and neighbors measure his strength. That's the truth under the legend. Not prophecy, not clean heroism. Pressure, choice, and consequence. Moving closer with every mile of dust and every tightening circle of riders on the horizon.
The German march across Anatolia isn't the kind of story that gives you clean, heroic scenes. It's not a tournament. It's not a duel. It's an experience, day after day, of being worn down by distance, heat, and an enemy who refuses to fight the way Western knights want him to fight. This is where the campaign becomes a kind of weather. You don't see a great battle every morning. Instead, you see dust. You hear hoofbeats that fade before you can respond. You feel the constant threat pressing against the edges of the column. Seljuk and Turkmen riders appear on ridgelines and then vanish. They strike at baggage, at foragers, at the stragglers who fall behind. They don't need to break the army in one dramatic moment. They only need to keep it under stress long enough for thirst, fatigue, and frustration to do the rest. Western sources, especially the ones written later, sometimes describe this as cowardice. But it isn't cowardice, it's a professional system built for this landscape. These riders are trained to exploit space. They hit quickly, keep distance, and punish any loss of discipline. If you're used to warfare where victory comes from a single collision of armored men, this kind of fighting feels infuriating. It feels unfair. That's exactly the point. And the Germans feel it. You can hear that frustration in the way chroniclers describe arrows, not as individual shots, but as something like rain, a hiss, then another, and then the dull thud of impacts on shields, on pack saddles, on the earth near a man's foot. It becomes constant enough that soldiers stop counting. They just raise their shields and keep moving. Mail helps, so do helmets and shields, but none of it makes you invulnerable. And it doesn't stop heat exhaustion. It doesn't stop dehydration. It doesn't stop the slow collapse of animals that have been pushed too far for too long. If you want to understand how campaigns end, look at the horses. A knight without a horse is still a fighter, but he's not the weapon he was trained to be. And the Anatolian march kills horses quietly, not with glory, but with bad water, little fodder, and endless miles. You see them breathing hard, flanks moving like bellows, sweat turning dust into crust. You see tack rubbing raw. You see men trying to hide fear behind discipline as they realize their cavalry is thinning even before a decisive battle begins. The Germans respond the way a disciplined army has to respond. They tighten formations, they protect wagons, they enforce pace. They don't chase every rider who appears, because chasing is exactly what the enemy wants. If you break formation, you become a collection of targets. But discipline comes with its own price. It forces men to endure, to keep walking when their bodies are begging them to stop, to watch raiders strike at the edges and not pursue, to let anger build and build until it becomes a kind of poison inside the mind. This is one of the things war does to people. It trains them to think in narrower and narrower terms. After enough days like this, a soldier begins to see every hill as an ambush, every patch of trees as a hiding place, every delay as an approaching disaster. Even the silence becomes suspicious. And once you start living like that, it changes how you see everyone around you. Because an army on the move doesn't only pass through enemy soldiers, it passes through villages, through fields, through people who might want to survive more than they want to choose sides. But when your men are thirsty and angry, civilians become part of the equation. They become possible threats, possible supplies, possible betrayals. That's where the moral pressure begins to build. You can understand why foraging parties go out. Armies need food, but those small groups are vulnerable, and the Seljuks know it. They strike quickly, forcing the foragers to run back to the main column carrying wounded men on cloaks, faces tight with fear and shame. Every time that happens, the army's mood darkens a little more. Then there's water, always water. There are moments on this march when a small spring or well becomes a battlefield without swords. Men line up, guarded, rationed. Some accounts suggest water sources were denied or contaminated, and whether every story is true or not, the fear is real. The fear alone changes behavior. A soldier leans toward a bucket and hesitates, smelling it, wondering if it will save him or kill him. An officer pushes the cup away and insists on restraint. Men argue in whispers because shouting doesn't change the taste of fear. And all the while, the riders return. They circle again, just out of reach. They release another volley. They withdraw. It becomes a rhythm designed to break will. I'm Steve Turkite, and I'll tell you something I think is important here. This is where the romantic image of crusading tends to collapse, not because faith disappears, because the body is real. The body doesn't care what you vowed in a cathedral. It cares about heat and thirst and sleep. The body cares about whether you can keep walking. A Western knight can be brave, but bravery doesn't answer an enemy who won't stand still. That's why some men begin to crack at the edges. Stragglers fall behind. A few panic when riders feint toward them. They sprint, loaded down, trying to rejoin the line before they're cut off. Sometimes older soldiers grab them and drag them back into formation like you drag a child away from a fire. Not gently, but effectively, because one man breaking can become 10, and 10 can become a collapse. Night doesn't bring peace either. It brings the threat of raids. Fires are kept small. Sentries are tense. The camp becomes a place of half-sleep and sudden alarms. When hoofbeats approach at the edge of torchlight, guards snap into position, shields up, spears braced. And sometimes it's a real attack, brief, sharp, ugly. Sometimes it's only a probe meant to keep the army awake. Either way, the effect is the same. Tomorrow's march begins with men already exhausted. By late afternoon, the sunlight turns long and amber. Banners become silhouettes against dust. The riders are still there, circling at the edge of vision, like a memory that won't leave. The Crusader host keeps moving anyway, not because it's easy, but because stopping has started to feel impossible. And that's what this phase of the story really is. It's the march as a battlefield, the land as an enemy, and an army learning painfully that the strongest armor in the world can't protect you from hunger, heat, and fear, only from steel.
By the time the Germans reach the outskirts of Iconium, the city isn't just another point on a route. It's a hinge, a place that can decide whether the crusade keeps moving towards Syria or bleeds out on the Anatolian plain. You can feel that in the air before anyone says it aloud. The walls rise in the distance, hard and geometric against the sky. Towers, gates, stone that looks permanent in a landscape that has punished the Crusaders for every mile. Even from far off, Iconium feels like a closed fist, and between that fist and the German camp, there's open ground, dusty, bright, and exposed. Inside the camp, nothing looks like a triumph. It looks like an army trying to survive one more day. Food is counted, not estimated, counted. Flour sacks are nearly empty, scraped for the last clinging powder. A quartermaster weighs out rations with the seriousness of a judge. A man watches a handful of grain fall into a bowl like it's gold, and in a way it is. Grain is time. Grain is movement. Grain is the difference between reaching the next river and dying before you get there. Water is treated the same way. Men line up, guarded. They drink measured sips and step aside. Nobody lingers. Nobody jokes. Even a small mistake at the cask can start an argument, and an argument can turn into something worse when everyone is exhausted. Meanwhile, the city watches. Defenders shift along the parapets in small motions you can barely see. Banners stir above the stonework. From the walls, the German camp must look like a threat and a prize at the same time. Tired men, tired horses, wagons that would be worth plundering. But the Germans know what those walls mean. They know Iconium is dangerous, yes, but it is also a storehouse, a shelter,
a place where the rules of the campaign might change for the first time in weeks. And that creates a brutal strategic truth. Barbarossa cannot afford a long siege. A siege is slow. It consumes time and supplies. It demands that an army sit still in hostile land while enemies gather around it. On paper, a siege sounds methodical. In reality, for an exhausted army far from home, it can be a death sentence. So in the command area, under lantern smoke and dripping wax, the conversation isn't about glory. It's about options and how bad each one is. A rough map lies on a table, more suggestion than measurement. Someone points at the city. Someone points at the road beyond it. Someone points at the dwindling supply notes scratched on parchment. Hands hover over the lines, then pull back because there's a kind of fear in committing to a decision. And the arguments are predictable because war forces predictable questions. Do we wait? Do we negotiate? Do we attempt a siege? Do we strike? Even the way the tent feels tells you the truth. It's cramped, hot, airless. Everyone's armor and clothing holds sweat and dust. Men speak quietly, not because they are calm, but because they are conserving energy, and because raising your voice doesn't make the walls lower. This is where I always picture candlelight on a commander's face. The eyes don't look heroic, they look tired and calculating. Because at this point in the march, courage isn't the rare thing, endurance is. Barbarossa listens, his officers argue. The young Duke Frederick stands close enough to see how power actually works, not in ceremonies, but in these heavy silences between sentences. And you can sense the weight on him too. He's the heir. He isn't allowed to be merely brave. He has to be useful. Outside, the camp changes while the commanders talk. Wagons are pulled into tighter lines. Defensive rings are strengthened. Sentries are posted with extra care. The horses are checked again. Leather straps are tightened, then tightened again, because a broken strap at the wrong moment can kill a man as surely as an arrow. And over it all is the feeling that time is running out. At night, the camp watches the ridgelines. Torches are kept low. The wind carries dust like smoke. In the distance, sometimes you can make out mounted silhouettes, Seljuk patrols, scouts, men who do not need to attack to be dangerous. The mere fact that they are there watching is pressure. A sentry turns his head at the faintest sound. A spear shifts in a hand. A man tries to sleep and can't because his mind keeps replaying the same thought. If we fail here, we may never leave this plain. Then the light changes again. Dawn returns, and with it comes a kind of grim clarity. The Germans form lines, banners rise, the cross and the imperial eagle lift into the pale sky, not like a parade, but like a statement. We are still here, we still move, we still intend to go forward. A brief prayer happens somewhere near a simple wooden cross and a cloth-covered crate. Heads bow, they rise quickly. Even ritual is compressed now by urgency. Faith is still present, but it has been packed down into something practical, something carried like a tool rather than displayed like jewelry. Scouts creep closer to the gate approaches. They move low, careful, measuring the ground, watching for movement on the walls. A messenger runs back through the camp, gear bouncing, breath ragged. He delivers information in quick bursts, the kind of information that makes officers glance at each other without speaking. Inside the command tent, the map is traced again. A finger taps Iconium, a finger drags toward the route beyond it, towards Cilicia, towards Syria. Everyone knows what the city represents, not a trophy, a solution. Outside the tent, kites mount slowly, carefully, because armor is heavy and horses are tired. Infantry tighten straps, lift shields, and take their places. A banner-bearer ties his knot one more time, yanks it hard to test it, and then grips the pole as if it's the last solid thing in his world. Barbarossa stands for a moment looking towards the walls. No dramatic gesture, no speech that turns misery into poetry, just the stillness of a man who knows the cost of delay. And then the army begins to move. Boots step forward in a unified rhythm. Hooves follow. Wagon wheels start to roll, jolting over stones. Dust rises in curls around ankles and hooves, catching the early light. From far away, the movement might look smooth. Up close, you would see the strain in every shoulder, the stiffness in every step. You would hear the quiet clink of mail and the creak of leather and wood. The plain between the camp and Iconium becomes a corridor. The walls loom larger with every minute, and the meaning of the city sharpens as the distance closes. If the Germans can take it quickly, they eat and march again. If they cannot, they may be trapped, exhausted, surrounded, and running out of time. This is the moment where the campaign stops being only a march and becomes a gamble. Not a gamble for glory, but a gamble for survival. And as the sun rises and the banners advance, you can feel that something is about to break, either the city's defenses or the Crusaders' strength.
Dawn breaks over the Anatolian plain with a kind of cruel clarity. The air is already dry, already dusty, and the light makes everything look sharper than it feels. Ahead, Iconium's walls begin to take shape, stone towers and gatehouses rising out of haze like something permanent, something that has watched armies come and go. The Germans don't have the luxury of treating it as a distant landmark. For them, it's either a solution or a grave. The Crusader host forms up in the dim blue hour, and when the first pale light spreads across the ground, the lines begin to move. Not quickly, not triumphantly. They move like an exhausted machine that has been forced back into motion. Boots press into dust, spear shafts sway and settle, shields lift and lower as officers walk the ranks, correcting gaps with small gestures, keeping the rhythm steady. Somewhere behind them, wagons and pack animals follow, loaded now with whatever they've managed to keep. But the front of the army is what matters. The front is what will either open the road or close it forever. Barbarossa's command has to do two things at once. One part of the force angles toward Iconium's gates. Another holds broader ground, absorbing the pressure of mounted archers who have learned to circle, sting, and disappear. Medieval battle accounts often turn moments like this into neat sequences, as if armies move like pieces on a board. The reality is messier. Detachments peel away by degrees. Orders ripple down lines through shouted messages and hand signals, and all of it happens while dust and fear cloud the air. The Seljuk cavalry appear again, sometimes as silhouettes on ridges, sometimes suddenly closer than anyone wanted. They ride in loose arcs, their horses quick and responsive, their bows always ready. The first arrows are almost quiet at a distance, a hiss, a dark flicker, then the thud of impact into wood and earth. The Germans react the way disciplined troops do. Shields come up in practice unison, overlapping into a wall of wood and iron. Arms absorb the shock as arrows strike, feet brace, bodies lean slightly into the pressure. Nobody wants to break formation, because the enemy is waiting for exactly that. And still, the Crusaders keep moving. This matters, because the Seljuk method depends on space and hesitation. It depends on an invader who stops to chase shadows, or who stands still long enough to be bled down by constant harassment. If the Germans refuse to stop, if they keep pressing forward, then the Seljuks are forced to decide how close they want to get. The air around the Crusader line becomes thick with dust. You can see it clinging to mail rings and settling into the seams of leather gloves. You can see it in men's eyes, in the way they blink harder, trying to keep sight of the ground and the line at the same time. Crossbowmen, few but valuable, work behind shields when they can. Spanning a crossbow takes time and strength. It isn't something you do in a rush.
The men who operate them move with compact precision, setting bolts, firing, stepping back, reloading, always aware that if the line breaks, they'll be swallowed. On one side of this shifting battlefield, Duke Frederick's detachment draws closer to the city. The wall grows taller, the ground narrows, the light changes as they enter the shadow of stone. Iconium turns the geometry of war into something intimate and dangerous. Out on open ground, you can at least breathe. Near the gate, you're pressed in by walls, towers, and the simple fact that every man wants to be close enough to matter. The gate itself dominates the view. Iron bands and rivets, thick wood, a dark mouth beneath a stone arch. Above it, defenders move along crenellations, setting arrows, gathering stones, watching the crowd compress below. If you've never been in a crush of bodies, it's hard to appreciate how quickly movement becomes physics. A man can't simply decide to step aside. The crowd decides for him. If someone falls, that space disappears instantly, filled by bodies pushing forward. And the pushing begins. A heavy timber is carried forward, not like a heroic weapon, but like a tool. Men coordinate their grips and set their shoulders beneath it. They move with that slow, heavy rhythm you only get when something is truly weighty. Then they slam the timber into the gate in measured strikes. The door flexes and rebounds. Splinters widen. The timber team resets their stance and strikes again. Above them, defenders respond. Stones and broken masonry come down, not in cinematic arcs, but in ugly, heavy drops that explode dust when they hit. Men duck under shields and scramble back into position. Someone gets clipped and stumbles. A comrade grabs him and hauls him upright. The timber team keeps working, because stopping is worse than pain. And while that gate fight intensifies, the larger battle on the plain continues. Seljuk riders circle and press too close, then wheel away when spear points bristle outward. The Germans maintain a broader defensive posture and hold their nerve. They close gaps when men fall. They take controlled steps forward when there's space to regain ground. They do all of this while arrows keep arriving in waves. This is not a single battle. It's two connected struggles happening at once. One is a grinding clash of formations in open sun. The other is a suffocating crush under a gate's shadow. The only thing they share is urgency. Sometimes there is a brief counterthrust by Crusader cavalry, knights on tired horses pushing forward a few strides, lances low, hoping to force the riders back. But it's never a full triumphant charge. The horses are too spent. After a short surge, the knights rein back, because even courage can't make a dying animal like a fresh one. The Seljuks feel this too. They can sense weakness, but they can also sense stubbornness. Each time they approach, the German line refuses to dissolve. Each time they expect a retreat, the Germans inch forward instead. It's infuriating. It's costly, and it starts to shift the psychological balance. Near the gate, the seam begins to strain. Iron bands hold, but wood gives in small ways. You see it in widening cracks and fresh splinters. You hear it in the change of sound when the timber hits, less dull, more hollow, as if the door is beginning to surrender. A horn sounds somewhere behind the press, not a triumphant blast, more like a signal that says, "Now, keep going, don't stop." Men tighten their grip. A line shifts. A small reinforcement moves at a walk toward the cityward side, careful not to tangle formations. No one is sprinting. Sprinting would mean losing control, and control is the only thing keeping them alive. Then a narrow gap appears between the gate leaves, just enough to let out darkness and smoke. It's the kind of opening that doesn't feel like victory. It feels like a new danger. Because a breach means you're about to enter a space where shields collide and bodies compress even tighter. Men wedge shields into the gap and push with legs and shoulders. Feet slip in dust. Hands strain on shield straps. The opening widens a fraction, then another fraction. The movement is inches at a time, driven by leverage and mass rather than speed. Inside the gate passage, the light changes again. Torch smoke hangs in the corridor. Stone walls are close enough to scrape. Defender silhouettes tighten into a line. And the first contact is not beautiful. It's compact. Shields slam. Short stabbing motions find openings. Men shove and brace and try not to fall, because falling in a narrow passage can be fatal. Out on the plain, the main body steadies. Seljuk riders begin to keep a slightly greater distance, not because they are afraid of courage, but because the rhythm they rely on is starting to falter. The Germans are not collapsing the way they're supposed to. This is where the story sits at the edge of breakthrough. Nothing is decided yet, but the pressure has changed. The Crusaders are still exhausted, still outnumbered, still deep in hostile land, and yet they have forced the fight into a space where harassment is less effective and discipline matters more. Iconium's walls fill the right side of the world now. The gate is no longer a symbol. It's a physical problem being solved with splinters, sweat, and bodies. And in the midst of dust and heat haze, under the cross and the imperial eagle, the German army keeps pushing, slowly, heavily, deliberately, toward whatever comes next.
When the Germans reach Iconium's walls, the war stops being wide and open and becomes narrow, crowded, and intimate. The geometry changes. Space disappears. Mobility, so deadly on the plain, starts to work against the defenders as streets and gates turn into funnels. You can feel that shift even before the first real breakthrough. The air near the walls is cooler in the shadow of stone, but it's also heavier. Dust hangs at chest height. Smoke from torches and small fires mixes with it until the light takes on a dirty yellow edge. Banners snap overhead, but down at ground level, nobody is thinking about symbols. They're thinking about footing, about breath, about whether the next shove will send them to the ground. At the gate, the fight becomes pressure. Not heroic single combat, pressure. Men shoulder in, shields wedged forward, bodies packed close enough to smell sweat and old leather. A heavy timber slams against iron-banded wood in a slow, brutal rhythm. The door flexes, splinters widen, and every impact sends a vibration through the men holding it, up into tired arms and bruised shoulders. Above them, defenders answer with arrows and stones. Debris drops hard, not like movie choreography, but like gravity doing its work. Dust explodes where it hits. Men flinch and duck, and then force themselves back into position, because you don't get to choose comfort in a crush. If you step back too far, someone else fills the space instantly. The crowd moves like a single organism, driven by fear and momentum. At some point, the seam gives. Not in a clean, dramatic moment, but in inches. A narrow gap opens into darkness, and smoke leaks out like the city itself is exhaling. That gap is the most dangerous kind of success, because it means the fight is about to move from open air into a stone corridor where bodies can't spread out and panic has nowhere to go. The first men wedge shields into the opening and push. Feet slip on grit, hands strain on straps. The door widens a fraction at a time. Then the Crusaders spill into the gate passage, and the noise changes. Outdoors you hear arrows and hoofbeats and wind. Inside a stone corridor, you hear impacts as blunt, heavy sounds, shields against shields, boots scraping on stone, short breaths, metal scraping against iron rims. This is where medieval warfare looks less like chivalry and more like work. Men don't swing swords in wide arcs. There isn't room. They shove, they stab, they wrestle for inches. The danger isn't only a blade, it's falling. If you go down in that passage, you can be trampled before anyone even knows you're there. Once the gate area breaks, the city begins to swallow the battle. Beyond the passage, Iconium streets are narrow. Low buildings and stone walls create corners and blind spots. An alley can hide a spear line. A doorway can hide a man with a knife. Smoke catches under eaves. Overturned stalls and broken pottery turn the ground into hazards. The first Crusaders out of the gate don't rush like looters in a story. The disciplined ones spread to corners and try to hold the entry point. They know the simplest danger. If the gate closes behind them, or if defenders seal the passage, they can be trapped in the city and cut apart street by street. So they move carefully, shields leading, weapons low, turning corners like men who understand that bravery doesn't stop a sudden stab from a doorway. But not every soldier is thinking like a commander. That's the other truth about taking a city. An army can have discipline and still have hunger, still have anger, still have a need for release after weeks of being hunted across Anatolia. When the storehouses appear, when a door bursts inward, and men see sacks, jars, barrels, something shifts. For starving soldiers, supplies are not simply logistics. They are relief. They are proof that the suffering might end. Hands tear open grain sacks and pale dust rises in lamplight. The sound of grain pouring out is strangely loud in a quiet room. In a corner, a man who hasn't eaten properly in days stares at food like he's afraid it will vanish if he blinks. And when he finally moves, it isn't graceful. It's urgent. It's human. This is where the knightly myth tends to crack. In later stories, Crusaders are often polished into heroes, and their violence is cleansed into something tidy. But a city taken by assault is rarely tidy. It's confusion, smoke, screams, and the simple fact that soldiers are still men. Some try to obey orders, some don't. Some commanders try to impose restraint. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they fail. If a fire starts, as it often does in a crowding medieval city, it doesn't wait for anyone's moral debate. An overturned brazier, a dry beam, a gust of wind, and suddenly smoke thickens over rooftops. Embers drift, streets fill with haze. Civilians run, because they always run when an army floods in, and medieval chroniclers rarely give them the attention they deserve. But they were there. They were in doorways clutching jugs, in alleys pulling children by the sleeve, in cellars holding their breath as armored men passed by. A city is not a garrison alone. It's families, it's merchants, it's the ordinary life that war crushes without asking permission. I'm Steve Torcutt, and this is one of the places where I can't help asking the question quietly, what does honor mean here? You can understand why a starving army takes food. That is survival. But looting rarely stops at food. Once discipline loosens, appetite grows. Some soldiers reach for cloth bundles, cups, anything that looks valuable. Sometimes another soldier blocks them. Sometimes a commander physically pulls them back by the strap, forcing obedience. And sometimes nobody stops them. It's not romantic. It's not clean. It's one of the moral knots that history hands us without explanation. Outside, beyond the walls, the larger Seljuk forces face a problem. Their strategy has been built on keeping the invader weak, exposed, and moving under constant pressure. But if the invader controls the city, then the rhythm changes. Supplies can be taken, shelter found, wounds treated. The Germans can breathe again, at least for a moment.
Inside Iconium, the Crusaders begin trying to rebuild order even as chaos still smolders. Guards are posted at intersections, storehouses are secured, torches are placed in sconces, patrols move through streets in measured steps, scanning corners, controlling key lanes. The men who are able to think beyond the next mouthful of food start acting like an occupying force, not a raiding band. And at the same time, you see exhaustion everywhere. Soldiers sit against stone walls with helmets off, breathing hard, soot and dust streaking their faces. They eat in silence. Relief is there, but it's not joy. It's the kind of relief that comes after terror, when your hands still shake and your mind hasn't caught up with your survival. Morning comes again, smoke thins into pale sky. The captured city looks different in daylight, more ordinary and more damaged. Fires die down, streets show broken doors and scattered debris. Banners hang over a place that was someone else's home yesterday. The gate behind them is breached, the walls still stand. The city is taken, but nothing about it feels pure. Iconium has given the Crusaders what they needed most, supplies, shelter, and the ability to continue, but it has also shown them what conquest really looks like at street level. Not a painting, not a hymn. A narrow lane filled with smoke, an overturned market stall, a terrified family pressed into a doorway, and soldiers, tired, hungry, hardened, trying to remember who they are supposed to be. That's the truth of Part 7, a victory measured not only in ground gained, but in what it does to the people who achieve it.
Once Iconium falls into German hands, the battlefield doesn't vanish. It changes shape. Outside the walls, the dust still drifts across the plain, but the rhythm that the Seljuks relied on, the long, patient harassment, has been disrupted. Their system depends on keeping an invading army hungry, exposed, and constantly moving under pressure. A city breaks that system. A city means storehouses, wells, shelter. A place where an exhausted army can finally stand still without immediately dying. And you can see it almost immediately in the way the Seljuk forces begin to pull back. Not in a single dramatic retreat, but in the way distance opens up. Mounted units that had circled close now keep farther away. Groups that had moved with confidence start to loosen. Standards waver in the dusty wind. The enemy doesn't vanish, but the certainty does. Near the gate approaches, German infantry reset their spacing. Shields come down from the overhead posture they've held for so long. Arms tremble a little as the weight shifts. Men breathe hard and blink grit out of their eyes. Some lean on spear shafts just for a second too long, like they're afraid their legs might forget how to hold them. The ground itself tells the story. It's littered with broken arrow shafts, dropped quivers, scraps of torn cloth from standards, and debris that doesn't belong to any side anymore. After hours of motion, the dust begins to settle, and the silence that follows feels strange, almost unnatural, because everyone has been living inside noise and threat for weeks. Inside Iconium, the story is even more complicated. Iconium is not the battlefield in the clean sense. It's a living place that has been forced into violence. Smoke still drifts above rooftops. The air carries the sharp scent of burned wood and hot metal. Some fires are dying. Others have been stamped out and left as black scars on beams and doorways. And the Germans begin doing what armies always do after a successful assault. They try to turn chaos into control. Supplies are the first priority. Not gold, not trophies, grain, water, tools, animals, anything that keeps the army moving. Men carry sacks through narrow streets with shoulders hunched under the weight. Barrels are rolled along stone floors, guided carefully so they don't smash and spill. Ropes are tied, tested, tightened. Clerks and officers make tally marks on parchment, trying to impose order with ink in a place that has just been torn open by steel. But those tallies are never perfect. This is where you have to remember that medieval numbers are slippery. Chroniclers love dramatic totals. Commanders exaggerate victories. Survivors tell stories that make sense of terror. And even honest men can't count accurately in the dust and smoke of a broken field. So what you end up with, what we still have, is a mixture of record and rumor. You might see two sheets of parchment side by side, each with different marks, different counts, different conclusions. And that, to me, feels honest, not because it's neat, but because it reflects what war actually does. It muddies truth. Outside Iconium, Seljuk forces regroup in the distance. A knot of riders gathers on a low hill, then begins to withdraw. Not because the war is over, but because the moment is lost. A strategy based on erosion can fall apart quickly when the enemy suddenly finds shelter and food. The Germans have changed the equation. Now the Seljuks have to decide whether they can afford to keep pressing, or whether the wiser move is to push this army onward, out of the heartland. And that's where negotiation enters. Some accounts suggest the Seljuks offered safe passage, guides, and provisions. That might sound surprising if you imagine medieval war as pure hatred, but it fits a brutal logic. If you can't destroy a dangerous force, you may prefer to feed it and move it along. Get it out of your territory before it becomes a deeper problem. So you can picture a white cloth raised on the plain, a flag of truce in the dust. Envoys approach at a careful walk. Crusader guards meet them at a measured distance. Reins tighten. Hands remain visible. Nobody relaxes. Diplomacy in this era is not a handshake. It's an exchange performed under the constant threat that one wrong movement can restart the killing. Inside Iconium, Barbarossa receives the message with the calm of a veteran ruler who has spent a lifetime in negotiations that could turn violent. He doesn't celebrate, he doesn't gloat, he listens, he makes a decision. His hand presses parchment flat beside a small cross and a map, and in that simple gesture you can feel the pragmatism. We have what we need, now we move. For Duke Frederick, the experience is different. He stands amid smoke and broken doors, watching wagons roll past loaded with grain, while civilians keep their distance. He's young enough to feel the thrill of achievement, but he's also close to the aftermath to understand what achievement looks like in real streets. The conquered city doesn't feel like a song. It feels like responsibility and unease. I'm Steve Turcotte, and this is the place where I always pause, because it's easy to tell a story where victory is clean. But when you look at Iconium honestly, victory is mixed. An army that has been starving finally eats. Men who have been hunted finally sleep under roofs. But a city has burned. Families have fled or hidden. Lives that had nothing to do with crusade vows are now part of the cost. War rarely gives you a tidy moral ledger. Still, the strategic impact is real. The Germans now have supplies. They have breathing room. And that means the march can continue. Inside Iconium, guards are posted at storehouse doors. Patrols move along key lanes. Barrels are secured. Wagons line up for departure. The occupiers try to bring back discipline, because discipline is what keeps an army from dissolving into a mob, and they can't afford to dissolve. Not here, not with the road still long. Night comes. Torches glow in sconces. Smoke thins but doesn't vanish. Soldiers eat porridge and bread in silence, scraping bowls clean as if they don't trust the world to keep feeding them. A man latches a warehouse door with a heavy timber, testing the bar as if he expects the city to fight back in the dark. Then morning returns again, pale and dusty. The wagons begin to roll. Straps are tightened. Packs are lifted. Oxen step forward under the yoke. The rear guard forms at the gate, shields up, heads turning to scan ridgelines. The cross-banners and the imperial eagle rise above the column, frayed and smoke-stained, but still visible. And in the distance, Seljuk riders watch from far hills. They do not charge, they do not disappear, they simply watch. A reminder that the campaign is not over, only altered. Iconium recedes behind the Germans, its smoke fading into the sky. Ahead, the land opens towards passes and roads that lead deeper into the eastern world. The Crusaders move on, resupplied and reshaped, carrying with them not just grain and water, but the memory of what it cost to take it. That's the moment Part 8 leaves us with, a victory that restores momentum, but doesn't restore innocence.
After Iconium, for the first time in weeks, the German Crusader host can breathe. You can picture the column leaving the city with wagons that finally look heavy for the right reasons. Barrels, grain sacks, tools, the kind of supplies that don't just feed men, but keep an army coherent. The banners of the cross and the empire still fly, dust-stained and frayed, but upright. And if you were marching in that line, you might let yourself believe the worst is behind you. Some of the sources suggest there was negotiation as well, offers of guides, provisions, and safe conduct. That can sound strange at first, until you remember how medieval strategy works when direct destruction fails. If you can't easily annihilate a dangerous foreign army, sometimes the practical choice is to push it onward, out of your heartland, like moving a fire away from your home before it catches. So the Germans move south and east, toward the rougher country that leads into Cilicia and beyond. The landscape changes as the road begins to climb. The air cools at night. The ground turns rocky. The easy open plains give way to narrower routes where a wagon can fail and block everyone behind it. And that's the trap of a victory in a long campaign. It solves your hunger for the moment, but it doesn't erase the physics of distance. It doesn't heal the wounded. It doesn't bring back dead horses. It doesn't restore the men who vanished along the road weeks earlier. Still, morale rises. Men eat more than a mouthful. They sleep under better shelter. They patch gear with proper materials instead of improvisation. For a brief stretch of days, the army feels like an army again, not a drifting band of survivors. But I always hesitate when a campaign story reaches this point, when everything seems to stabilize, because history has a brutal habit of turning on something small. In early summer of 1190, Frederick Barbarossa reaches a river crossing in the region modern historians associate with the Salif River, today's Göksu in southern Turkey. It's the kind of detail that would barely register in a heroic tale. A river, a crossing, another obstacle on the map. Except this time, it isn't just an obstacle, it's the ending of an era. The precise circumstances of Barbarossa's death are debated in the sources. Some accounts imply an accident during the crossing, perhaps his horse losing footing, perhaps the current catching him at the wrong angle. Others suggest he entered the water more deliberately, maybe to cool off, and was overwhelmed by cold water, exhaustion, and the weight of his equipment. Medieval writers don't always agree, and they rarely give you the kind of clinical clarity we'd like, but they agree on what matters most: the emperor drowned. And the irony is almost unbearable. A man survives decades of war and politics, survives the Anatolian March, survives the hard choice at Iconium, and then a river takes him. Not in a grand duel, not under a storm of arrows, but in water that would have looked ordinary the moment before it became fatal. If you want to understand how much leadership matters in medieval warfare, look at what happens next. An army like Barbarossa's isn't just bound together by discipline, it's bound together by legitimacy, by the belief that this march has a center, a purpose, a figure who makes endurance feel meaningful. When that figure is suddenly gone, the entire structure begins to loosen, quietly at first, and then faster than anyone can fully stop. You can imagine the scene on the banks. Wet cloaks, mud, men standing in rigid silence because nobody knows what to say, officers giving orders that sound smaller without the emperor's voice behind them, a banner drooping in damp air as if cloth itself understands what has happened. Duke Frederick of Swabia steps into a role he never wanted this quickly. He doesn't inherit a throne in a quiet hall, he inherits a crisis in the open, with an exhausted army watching him. He has to lead men who are grieving, frightened, and already thinking about home, and he has to do it in terrain that still punishes every mistake. Some continue, many don't. This is where a crusade stops being a unified movement and becomes a set of individual decisions. Men ask themselves, in private, whether their vow is still possible without the emperor, whether the road ahead is worth it, whether survival is a better form of piety than martyrdom, and once a few begin to drift away, others follow. Desertion doesn't always look like cowardice. Sometimes it looks like quiet resignation. Disease and exhaustion do what Seljuk arrows couldn't. The march resumes, but it's thinner now. Spacing in the column widens, gaps appear. The cohesion that made Barbarossa's army so formidable begins to erode. I think this is one of the hardest truths in Crusade history. We remember battles because they have shapes and names, but campaigns often collapse for reasons that feel almost humiliating. A bad crossing, a sickness, a supply failure, the loss of a single person at the top. War in the end is not a romance, it's a test of systems, and systems fail when their central supports disappear. If you stand back and look at the larger Third Crusade, you can see how this moment changes everything. Richard and Philip will still arrive and fight. The siege of Acre will still grind on. Negotiations and victories will still happen. But Barbarossa's overland force, the one that might have shifted the balance with sheer mass and experience, no longer arrives as the coherent hammer it was meant to be. And that leaves you with questions that aren't comfortable but are honest.
What is honor when the leader who embodied it is suddenly gone? What is faith when your body is exhausted and the road still stretches on? How much of what we call destiny is really just the fragile chain of cause and effect, one link snapping at the worst possible time? Barbarossa's death doesn't erase Iconium. It doesn't make that victory meaningless, but it reminds us how quickly a campaign can turn, and how thin the line is between we survived and we dissolved. That's where Part 9 ends for me, not with a triumphant march, but with a river's cold indifference, and an army learning, in the most painful way, that even the strongest reputation in Europe cannot outswim history.
When Frederick Barbarossa died in the river, the shock didn't stay at the shoreline. It traveled through the entire German host like a crack in a beam. An army can survive hunger, arrows, and long marches, but it's harder to survive the sudden loss of the person holding it together. In the days that followed, the Crusaders kept moving, because the land didn't care about grief. But the movement changed. The pace became uneven. The spaces between units widened. Men who had endured weeks of hardship under the emperor's banner began asking a question they'd been afraid to say out loud. What are we now? Duke Frederick of Swabia inherited the command in the worst way possible. Not in a hall, not in a ceremony, but on the road, with tired men watching his face to see whether the world was still stable. He was young, but youth doesn't matter much when you're carrying an entire army's morale on your shoulders. He had to become overnight the center of gravity his father had been for decades. And he tried. We shouldn't romanticize it. A new commander can't simply replace a legend. He can issue orders, enforce discipline, promise reward, threaten punishment. But what he can't do is recreate the force of an emperor's reputation. In medieval warfare, that kind of authority isn't only about rank. It's about a lifetime of fear and respect. When he disappears, everything that was held in place by it begins to loosen. So the German army thinned. Some men pressed on out of devotion, loyalty, or stubbornness. Others drifted away, not always dramatically, sometimes quietly at the edge of camp, taking a side road and choosing home over a vow that now felt impossible. Disease and exhaustion did their work too. The march didn't end, but the great overland host that had once seemed like a second crusade within the crusade was no longer intact. Still, Duke Frederick brought what he could to the eastern Mediterranean. He reached the world of the Crusader states, and then he walked into a new kind of war, the siege of Acre. If Iconium was a violent solution to a supply problem, Acre was the opposite. Acre was grinding persistence, a ring of camps and trenches, smoke hanging over a coastline, engineers pulling ropes until hands bled, infantry hauling baskets of earth day after day to move a line forward by a few yards. It was a place where courage mattered, but endurance mattered more. The sources make it clear that Duke Frederick remained a significant figure among the Crusaders there. But the siege didn't care about his name. It swallowed men the way the march had swallowed horses, slowly, constantly, without the clean drama of a single decisive moment. In 1191, Duke Frederick died during that campaign. The exact circumstances are less famous than the fact itself. Father and son, both gone within a short span, consumed by the same expedition that had begun with so much confidence. It's hard not to feel the tragedy in that. Barbarossa's triumph at Iconium had briefly made the impossible look achievable. But the crusade didn't end with that victory. It kept demanding more, and it took what it demanded from the people who had least room to give it. Meanwhile, far back in Anatolia, Sultan Khalid Arslan II remained part of a region that did not pause for Crusader narratives. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum didn't simply collapse because a city was taken and a field battle was lost. Power in medieval Anatolia was layered. Sultans, princes, commanders, tribal forces, local interests, and the constant balancing act of rule. Even a strong ruler could not always command perfect unity, especially in a realm where internal rivalries mattered as much as external threats. So, Iconium becomes, historically, less like a final blow and more like a revealing moment. It shows how vulnerable a system can be when an enemy refuses to break in the way you expect. It also shows how quickly victory can turn into a strategic choice. Negotiation, safe passage, the decision to push the Crusaders onward rather than keep bleeding the heartland. Those aren't the moves of a caricatured villain. They're the moves of a ruler trying to keep a realm intact. And back on the Crusader side, the Third Crusade continued without Barbarossa's full force arriving as a unified army. Richard the Lionheart became the dominant figure in many later tellings, and for good reason. But even Richard's brilliance didn't produce a clean ending. The Crusade achieved victories, negotiated truces, and carved out survival, but not the kind of decisive, permanent reversal that some European leaders had imagined when they first heard the news from Jerusalem. This is where the myth of the Crusade runs into the reality of medieval war. People often want a simple arc, noble departure, heroic struggle, righteous victory. But campaigns aren't shaped like that. They're shaped like weather. They shift, they stall, they consume leadership, they punish small mistakes, and sometimes they end not with a final battle, but with exhaustion and compromise. I keep coming back to a quieter question. What is honor in a story like this?
It's easy to say honor is bravery, but bravery can be reckless. It can be pride and armor. Honor can also be discipline, the ability to hold a line while arrows fall, the ability to ration water, the ability to restrain looting when hunger is screaming in your mind. And then there's the darkest truth. Honor is often what people call their choices after the fact, once they need those choices to feel meaningful. Iconium, the March, the River, Acre, none of these episodes give us perfect heroes. They give us human beings under pressure. An aging emperor gambling against the slow death of delay. A young duke trying to carry a legacy that was never meant to be carried alone. A sultan managing a realm where power was never as simple as a single throne. If you take something away from part 10, I hope it's this. History doesn't belong to myths. It belongs to people, and people are always more complicated than the stories we tell about them afterward. I'm Steve Turcotte. Thanks for staying with me to the end of this journey.